So, good evening and a really warm welcome to this wonderful event, which is the first lecture discussion of the year 2015. And I'm really very happy that you're all here. This event is something that's really been made possible, as you saw earlier, in collaboration with the support, guidance, stewardship of Club Medina, and of course a lot of input from many of our students and faculty. We're really hoping that under this rubric of the Aga Khan lectures, we will have many more events, conversations that will happen both during the coming semester, but of course into the next academic year. I'm also very happy and delighted that Professor Diane Singerman is here with us to speak to us. The format for tonight is going to be a lecture by Diane, then followed by a brief response, a kind of rebuttal by Shahira Fahmy, who is one of our own Loeb Fellows. And then we will have a conversation here together. We're also very delighted that Abdul Basir El Sayed, who has been staying in DC and working together with Diane, has made the trip from Washington, and he is currently in the kind of last stages of his PhD program in urban planning in Cairo. And so he's also able to add, his perspective. As many of you know, Shahira, she has been here at the GSD as a Loeb Fellow, and she's an architect who has worked in Cairo, but also in many other places, and has her firm has won many awards, and she's also taught recently at Columbia. So it's really wonderful that Shahira is able to be the respondent. And of course, Professor Diane Singerman has done an enormous amount of work focusing on Cairo. She's currently an associate professor at the American University in DC, and she spent a lot of time, it seems, at Princeton University, where she did her undergraduate and graduate work, and then, of course, spending time in Cairo. She has many publications. One of them is called Avenues of Participation: Family, Politics, and Networks in Urban Quarters of Cairo, which seems to be one of her early publications. Then this lovely book called Cairo Contested: Governance, Urban Space, and Global Modernity, which came out in 2009, which she edited with lots of great articles. And then Cairo Cosmopolitan: Politics, Culture, and Urban Space in the New Globalized Middle East, which she co-edited with Paul Amar. And Development, Change, and Gender in Cairo, an earlier book, which she co-edited with Homa Hoodfar in 1996. Her research interests lie within comparative politics, gender and politics in Egypt and the Middle East, informal politics, political participation, urbanism, youth, globalization, and social movement. I think when you read her material, you notice that her work is really very much in the present, and she's really linking her investigations also with various modes of participation in the context of local communities. I think this is something that is, in a way, both very interesting and very relevant for us, because it situates the investigations of the contemporary in relation to how one really can act and what one can do. And so the connections between these investigations and, in a way, the potential roles that we can play in the context of our school as architects, planners, and landscape architects is really very important and very relevant. So I'm looking forward to the presentation and to the discussion afterwards. Please welcome Professor Diane Singerman. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here, and to the Medina Club, to the Dean, as well as to Chantal, who made many of the arrangements. It's very nice to be here. Many years ago, I was a starving graduate student, writing my dissertation in Cambridge for 2 years and teaching, TAing at Harvard. So it's interesting for me to be back. I want to start out with some of the slides from the new developments, the desert cities, the huge array of sprawling new gated communities in the desert that have sprung up as a kind of part of the urban planning paradigm in Egypt. And you can see the names that are used: Beverly Hills, Hyde Park, etc. And at the same time, Cairo is very much informal areas are proliferating. About 85% of all new housing in Cairo is from the informal sector, unzoned, unregulated, often built on illegal land. So you have this kind of paradox. As the dean said, I'm a political scientist. I know very little about architecture, but a few years ago, I was involved with many French colleagues in Cairo at CEDEJ, doing these 2 books on how globalization, resistance, space, and politics kind of interacted. And through these 2 books, I also got to know more architects and more planners, and it was a very interesting direction for me that was a bit unexpected. But we were looking at the city, and we were looking at changes in the city. This was before the revolution, and we were looking at the ways in which neoliberalism, and for the last 8 years, since President Sadat was in office, really, but accelerated in the 90s, which its traits are shared throughout the region, some say throughout the world, but privatization of a very large public sector, a globalized economy needs lower wages, unemployment became very high, especially because the public sector shed many of its employees. Very few of the jobs produced were what the ILO calls good jobs, stagnant wages. Labor migration was a way for people to continue to support their families, but they had to leave. And the government and the United States and lots of other actors promoted free trade, foreign investment zones, reopening the Egyptian stock market, etc. And again, in order to compete globally, you had to keep wages low. I'm just going to sort of lay out some of these general trends and sort of move on to what I'm doing now, which is much more about kind of analytic activism. But you all probably have heard and know about the sort of neoliberal housing paradigm. So the government decided to solve Egypt's problems. They're going to build 44 new cities throughout the country, largely in the desert, largely around Cairo, which I'll talk about in a minute. And again, a lot of this devolved into what's called crony capitalism, a lot of real estate speculation, a lot of people becoming extremely wealthy, and at the same time, a kind of fortress architecture where wealthy people and upper middle class people and even middle class people would isolate themselves and then recreate this kind of imagined community and have golf courses and kindergartens, etc. And of course, a lot of this was the state and the military selling off land at very reduced prices. So in other words, as Eric Denis says, it's like Egypt selling its public patrimony. And at the same time, stopping to build affordable housing. So where's affordable housing? Affordable housing is really largely in the informal sector. And you get this incredible spread of self-built residential housing and around the perimeter of Cairo. And at the same time, during the same period, you have this fortress architecture, privatizing exclusivity, right? And these kind of dreams of a very different lifestyle, aesthetics, decor, architecture. You also had the Islamist varieties of Islamic architecture influenced by the Aga Khan program, and so you had a sort of Islamic variety of that. You had garden varieties, all sorts of things. You had the Americana, whatever, right? But again, this was a kind of only available to the wealthy or the upper middle class and subsidized by the state, right? And sold off to certain people at certain prices in a non-transparent way, etc. So we have this kind of informal economy skyrocketing, and this is something I wrote about in my first book, in the Informal Economy, so much so that 60% of all workers were employed in the informal economy, and those workers, while they have jobs, they don't receive benefits. They don't pay taxes, and they don't receive maternity leave, paid vacations. They're not protected by regulation. 80% of all new housing in the Greater Cairo region, 80% of all new housing and 65% of the Greater Cairo region population in 2006 is in the informal sector. So it's huge. And what's really also very weird is that for many, many years, nobody paid attention to it, right? It's like in the 80s, the government decided they discovered the informal areas. And why did they discover informal areas? Because Islamists were operating in them. So when Islamist movements started fighting the police and fighting the government, and the movement started to grow, all of a sudden the government decided maybe we need to take care of these places, maybe we need to surveil these places, we need to get our tanks in there, we need to get our fire engines in there, we need to build police stations in there. So there was a kind of upgrading that went on, but at the same time there was a discourse of demonizing these areas. These were places where poor people lived, where criminals lived, where the uneducated lived. They were full of garbage. And when you analyze the media production around these areas, all of the residents were criminalized, right? So whoever became a resident in that space became part of this discourse of these savage, backward people that were threatening the civilized people of Cairo, right? So you have this kind of class discourse going on. And of course, this is neoliberalism without citizenship. So it's free trades without freedom, right? And the state perceives most of collective life, of civil society, as threatening. So when people organize, however innocuous it might be, the state perceives this as threatening. And I'll go back to this in a minute, right? So just to recap, the Mubarak era, high modernist planning, not participatory, not representative, not inclusive, desert expansion, neoliberal investment, and again, Cairo was supposed to compete with Dubai, right, and with Abu Dhabi. It was supposed to bring in investment. And a lot of it was monumental architecture that was supposed to brand a city that already had its own brand, right? So Medinati is one of the huge complexes that were built, I think by an MIT grad from the Aga Khan program anyway. So, but at the same time, as the revolution came about, the housing minister, for example, was imprisoned. I'm pretty sure he's out of jail by now. But immediately after the revolution, a lot of the most high-level people involved in this whole, these schemes, the plan of the government, were in jail, right? And so you have just this huge discrepancy about foreign investment, domestic investment, Gulf, American, invested in these new areas in real estate. That was supposed to, of course, increase GDP. It was supposed to employ people. And the same metaphors and arguments are still being used today, right? And the plans, which was Cairo 2050, one of the new plans, which I'll discuss in a minute, is being kind of, is completely reappropriated today as Cairo 2030, right? And rather than sort of invest in situ development in place, renovation, rehabilitation, et cetera, let's just start with tabula rasa. It's easy to construct anew rather than to renovate. Of course, there's only one problem. Nobody lives in these cities, right? The number of people that live in all these cities is minuscule. There's huge problems with transportation, with the lack of jobs. And Egyptians and Cairenes like to be where their social networks are, where their family is. So people wind up being internal migrants to their own jobs back in the city, right? Gamal Mubarak was in charge of one of the high modernist visions, the most important one of Cairo. And again, you can see the banks of the Nile. You can see this is actually Giza, which is just over the Nile, right here, right? And again, building, actually it might be the other way around. Building high skyscrapers, etc. The problem with this was it was all confidential, right? The only way people found out about it is when they went to international conferences in Germany, in Europe. Nobody could see what this plan was unless they got hold of the slides at some international conference, right? And sorry, just one second. Okay, so you know, the idea was Cairo was going to be a global capital. And a lot of investment, a lot of consultants, a lot of architects were involved in these plans. Can't go into this at the moment, but of course this is not just in Cairo, this is regional, if not global. Anna Singh and others have talked about this kind of financial conjuring that goes on, hot places that's going to make people a lot of money, right? And we've seen examples of that. Unfortunately, in Cairo, the area that was supposed to be filled with those skyscrapers and also a road to the pyramids was going to be carved out in order to facilitate new tourism, happened to go through one of the most densely populated areas in the city. And there are about 2 million people that live in Bulaq al-Dakrur, right? And so this means forced evictions, which are never talked about and never discussed, but it's just assumed that this is better for the country, better for the economy, right? So just really briefly, Cairo has really expanded on a kind of east-west axis. The Greater Cairo region is made up of 3 provinces, and about 75% of the inhabitants live within about 30 kilometers from the center. And the idea is that Cairo itself is overpopulated, we need to use the desert, and we should expand out. And the state also made it worthwhile for various institutions like the American University in Cairo. The sort of high status parts of the government started moving out to these areas as well. The finance ministry, other ones, right? And so you have this east-west expansion of these new cities. And again, just really briefly, Cairo's population has expanded. This shows the farmland. In 1999, when there are 14.5 million people. By 2013, the farmland has receded, and there's now 20 million people. And you can see where the informal areas are in red, right? All around the periphery or the margins of Cairo. It's illegal in Egypt to build on agricultural land because it's so scarce. And of course, that's where all the building took place. So by definition, a lot of the building that happened was on agricultural land. People bought and sold the land, even though it was illegal, and then they would register the transaction in a court. And they would buy and sell apartments, etc. So there was a whole system, but it was an illegal system at one level, right? And again, this just shows the expansion into farmland and the desert. And again, it's interesting to point out a lot of desert area is owned by the military, because it used to be considered a strategic asset. So whatever the military thinks is a strategic asset, it controls. So in lots of countries where the government would own the land, or marginal land, or public lands, it's actually the military that owns a lot of that land, which has certain repercussions, right? This is one of the most, I mean, not the only, but one of the very controversial aspects of Cairo 2050. So I'm going to show you in a minute Al-Azhar Park, which was a pretty resounding success, some criticisms, but built by the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, right? But right across the street from Azhar Park are the cemeteries, the Eastern cemeteries, which go on for miles and miles. And because of the increased value of the land, now that there's this nice greenscape and this public park, which is so rare in Cairo and in Egypt, that land became very valuable. And so the idea was, let's move the cemeteries. Sorry, let's just move the cemeteries. And again, rumors, no public information, no transparency, no way for people to understand the value of land or what's happening to the value of land, right? And all in secret. And trying to find out information about this was also difficult. At the same time, not to go into it too much, but the government started setting up the Informal Settlements Development Fund, right? And the ISDF went around the country deciding 4 levels of whether an informal area was unsafe. How unsafe was it? Now, one might consider that's a good thing because there were rock slides, there were people getting killed, or they were living near cliffs, et cetera, et cetera. There were these horrible tragedies, but at the same time, no public information. So people don't know if their land is listed there. They don't know if it's going to be destroyed by the government, if they're going to be removed. Again, it's that issue of transparency and accountability, right? The results of this, again, many more informal settlements, unzoned, unregulated, illegal, but the place for affordable housing, basically. And the expansion of a formal and exclusionary model of developments in the desert with lots of real estate speculation and a lot of people becoming extremely wealthy. At the same time, kind of leaving the urban core, some infrastructure improvements, but it becomes very difficult for people to figure out how to renovate or rehabilitate their houses, their communities, how to get the proper permits for things, who do they have to see, how do buildings get declared, what is the word, that you need to destroy them, demolished, et cetera. All kinds of this legal framework were very obtuse, right? So then there was a revolution, right? And in 2011, all of a sudden, even though many political scientists and lots of others talked about the passivity of Egyptians and authoritarianism and how strong it was, all of a sudden you have millions and millions of people calling for dignity, freedom, and social justice. And social justice didn't get a lot of attention in the United States. Of course, it was also the end of the regime, and everybody wanted the end of the regime, or many people did. But social justice was also extremely important because, again, Egyptians have a commitment, a concern for equality. And there's a great deal of inequality that's very structural and that they deal with, and lots of abuse that they deal with. So social justice was also an extremely important point or claim of the revolution. And as you all know, millions of people reclaimed Tahrir Square as a public space. And they reimagined and they claimed that space. And they called for social justice. Now, in Cairo Cosmopolitan and Cairo Contested, one of the things that many of myself and colleagues had been working on is the way in which neighborhoods surrounding Tahrir Square had been fighting with the government about forced evictions. Some of those areas, people had been removed when they built the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and other things. And so there was a collective memory of contestation over land, over space, over forced removals that housing rights people, human rights activists, et cetera, had been very involved with. So we asked the question about social justice in the built environment. What does it mean to talk about issues of housing and renovation and community space and public space as social justice, right? And around the time of the revolution, you may remember the police withdrew at one point in time. And some people say this might have been a tactic of the army and the police to terrorize people, but Egyptians all of a sudden were extremely afraid because Egypt had been a very, very stable, very, very crime-free city and country. Anyway, overnight, everywhere around the country and the city, these popular committees formed where neighbors got together. These guys, I think they're holding some, the richer neighborhoods, they got their golf clubs out. The poorer neighborhoods, they got their sticks out. And you had these popular committees all over the country in little neighborhoods, and they patrolled the streets, they kept criminals out, they asked people what they were doing, etc. From these popular committees, and just from the revolution, there was this incredible pent-up desire to change things. And everybody had an initiative, they're called, initiatives. And everybody mobilized, and people formed private charitable organizations. And they started making demands on the government. So this one says, we're not going to pay for electricity because of the electricity blackouts. You know, we're not going to pay because we don't get any clean water. You know, there were various kind of voluntaristic things. You know, yeah, I'm sorry. We don't want to die because of a Buttigas cylinder exploding, right? So very local, very kind of materialist claims, and this was kind of unheard of, right? And some of these really got a lot of attention. At the same time, there was organizing around historic buildings that were being destroyed and demolished. And remember, this is a security vacuum. The police have disappeared. The government's afraid of the people. And at the same time, some people, landlords, use this as an opportunity to destroy buildings that they hadn't been able to destroy before in order to sell the very valuable land, right? Again, people were organizing around all sorts of things. So what's kind of interesting about all of this is that before the revolution and after the revolution, the Freedom and Justice Party and Mohammed Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood, as you know, won the elections and they came to power in 2012. Whether it was the Mubarak regime, the Morsi regime, or General Assisi, who is now the current president of Egypt, the same urban planning paradigm predominated. The same, we're going to build now 1 million units of affordable housing, but the point is they're going to build 1 million units, right? They're going to build more new cities. They're going to re-subdivide governorates, and they're still demonizing the poor, right? They might need the poor a little bit for elections now, but there's this whole discourse of how backward, the same discourse continues, right? So this is the origins, long story, of Tadammun, which is the Cairo Urban Solidarity Initiative, right? And this is a initiative. It's a project that I started with a colleague who is an architect and an urban planner in Cairo. There is an architectural partnership that also does urban planning. That's a new partnership. They started in about 2009. Many of these architects and planners worked for the Aga Khan Trust for Culture. And the reason we started talking is because I saw the work that they did of renovating ordinary housing in Darb al-Ahmar. So you have, I'll show you the Azhar Park in a minute, but as part of that project, they also renovated very ordinary 19th century housing, and they figured out how to do a good job, how to do a simple job, how to get people involved in that. And so since about 2010, we've been involved in this project, which we like to think of as analytic activism, as kind of creating an urban think tank or an urbanist think tank in Cairo. And again, as I said, this is the road to the pyramids that is going to be built, this huge wide boulevard that means they're going to have to throw out all kinds of people. And Cairo 2050 has become the Cairo Strategic Urban Development Vision. And this is, again, the road to the pyramids, and the idea is they're going to redevelop this area, Nezlet el-Saman, much to the resistance of the local people who are supposed to go to these participatory planning meetings and community meetings, but they're not really invited and they're not going. And it's the same paradigm. So here, back to my more academic hat, I draw on Jim Holston's notion. He has a wonderful book on Brazil called Insurgency Citizenship. He writes there are two understandings of citizenship. And of course, one is just membership in the nation state, the kind of idea of citizenship that we think about. But the second is about the substantive distribution of the rights, meanings, institutions, and practices that membership entails to those citizens, right? So what happens when you have differentiated citizenship? When social differences that are a consequence of one's birth, where one happens to live, whose parents are, That's what becomes the basis of national membership. So it's differences of education, literacy, illiteracy, property or informal tenure, race and gender, which means that people get different rights. And this leads to a system, and it's a system. It's not arbitrary, it's not voluntaristic, of a gradation of rights. And in Cairo, informal tenure means that you have less access to public goods and services. One of the things that we're doing now in Tadammun is to look at the spatial inequality in Cairo and to map it out and to visualize it in a very sort of simple graphic way so people will be able to talk about this and understand it a little bit more. Not understand it, but just represent it. Again, so in the new budget in 2014, new cities will be given 24 times higher funds than upgrading all of Egypt's densely populated informal areas, right? So public investment directed to improve one new city, the 6th of October, which is a more successful one of these new cities, is 2.5 times higher than public investment directed to the upgrading of all of Egypt's targeted informal and unplanned areas. One city, which is actually now, the reason it's successful is because there's so many Syrian refugees that are there. And the Syrian refugees have really created a community there because there's so much vacant housing for cheap prices, right? So at Tadammun, we start talking about the right to the city and the importance of the right to the city and the democratic management of the city and kind of trying to figure out what that really means in terms of urban and environmental rights. And we write policy briefs on these issues. We try to do it in kind of everyday language. We don't always succeed. We do it in English and we do it in Arabic. And we're also looking at things like the right to public space, the right to a cultural heritage, to sustainable environment. But we're also looking at it within the Egyptian context and in the Egyptian constitution, for example, that these are not foreign terms. These are not external terms, so to speak. So Tadammun, you know, the kinds of issues that we think are important to raise and to write about have to do, again, with this unequal distribution of public services, undifferentiated citizenship, et cetera. At a different level, rather than a global Cairo, we'd like to look at a kind of a local Cairo, to look at local space and the local scale, and almost to see the revolutionary change, even though it hasn't succeeded at one level, as a very local effort. But that not everybody should have to go to Tahrir Square to solve their problems, right? So this is, just very briefly, the Aga Khan Trust for Culture project in Egypt. And the reason I highlight this is not because we're at the Aga Khan lecture program, but that what's really interesting about this project, $250 million investment, Egyptian funds, Aga Khan funds, US government, USAID funds, others, Ford Foundation, is they took a 500-year-old garbage dump on the edge of the Fatimid city, and they made a public park out of it that was designed somewhat collaboratively with different kinds of the usage was a mixed usage. And at the same time, they renovated the walls of the city, the Ayyubid city, which actually were under rubble. So they had to excavate it, and there were several archaeological sort of finds. They did a lot more excavating than they planned to because they found a lot more. And at the same time, they decided they wanted to also renovate and rehabilitate the area over the wall, which is Darb al-Ahmar. And Darb al-Ahmar people had been leaving the area because they couldn't find work. Some of it had become sort of the place you went to get hashish and marijuana, or really hashish. And so people were leaving the area. And they worked with the community. They renovated housing, about 250 apartments. They did it collectively, and it was a success, right? It was a success that's been copied and replicated. Now we have the Suzanne Mubarak Public Park. We have other green spaces, which of course were part of the historical landscape of Cairo before. And there used to be many public gardens and ponds and lakes, et cetera. And that had been really lost. And again, anyway, so the question becomes, how do you take these very expensive donor-funded projects and normalize? Why did it take the Aga Khan and his political capital and his closeness with the Mubarak regime to make this happen? Right? Why can't ordinary people make this happen? Why can't ordinary people renovate their houses? What are the bizarre regulations and the obstacles, right? So, So what we're trying to do at Tadamman, again, is to try to unpack some of the regulations, to understand how the 31 different entities manage the city, and what are the laws and the rules governing those 31 different entities. That each time there's a new plan about Cairo, a donor creates a new institution, or the government creates a new institution, or they create a new lab, and all of these kind of work at cross purposes as well. And if you ask Egyptians, where do you go to do X, Y, and Z? They know the informal way to do things, but they don't necessarily know the formal way of doing things. So we wanted to sort of try to unpack that. And at the same time, as I said, I've been working with architects and planners. Some of their colleagues are very surprised to hear them start talking about politics and to be involved in something like this, but there is a whole generation and there's a whole cluster of architects and professionals and others working in Cairo because they understand the politics of building and the built environment. And also they've been successful. They know in the Aga Khan project, you know, sometimes they would work for 13 years in order to get the permits to renovate a certain building. But they did it, and they know how to navigate the bureaucracy. This isn't something that is external. This isn't something that can't be done. And it's important to replicate successes and to talk about successes. You know, we can all be critical, but let's sort of try to pay attention to and highlight some of the successes, right? Now, at the same time, and this goes to something that I'm a little bit more interested in, maybe than others, is the question of local government. And as architects, you know about zoning and regulations and setbacks and plot maps, et cetera. And what's very interesting about the Egyptian case and the Middle Eastern case is the question of the municipal level, local government. In Egypt, it's not even called local government, it's called local administration, right? And it's very unrepresentative, it's very undemocratic, it's very centralized. And Tadamman tries to argue that it's a very weird thing to talk, and Americans in particular, political scientists are the most at fault about talking about democratization and elections at the national level. But what's going to happen after Morsi gets elected? Does he get to put his own people in power? What's a political appointee? What's a civil servant? These issues aren't worked out. And the Egyptian level, we ask, why did it stop? Why did the revolution stop at the municipal level, right? If you ask Egyptians about local politics and the municipal level, they can't tell you how it works because nobody pays attention to it at one level because it's so centralized and sort of executive driven. So, I mean, I should go back here, but there are local, before the revolution, there were local people's councils. And even though opposition forces before the revolution were able to carve some political space out to the point where the Muslim Brothers got 19% of the last parliamentary elections, at the local level, the one party, the National Democratic Party, refused any opposition at the local level. So you have this ironic situation where people dismiss this as, oh, it's just about parking and lighting and it doesn't matter, but that's where you get permits, right? That's where you have to go to get the approval of the local engineers before you can build anything. And so people also see it as a very corrupt level of governance, right? But so at the revolution, because the NDP dominated these local people's councils, they were disbanded immediately, and there have not been local elections since. And now we're almost talking 3 years, 3.5 years, right? It was underfunded, very centralized. There was an executive council, there was a people's council, but the executive council kind of ran everything. I will go through this quickly, but the local councils were supposed to supervise things like paving and parking and lighting and subsidize bread distribution, which is a big issue, sanitation, sewage, right? They supposedly could suggest new taxes, but basically local administration was like Florida for the military. It's where they retired. After you served 20, 25 years, you were given a point in local administration. They were the worst paid employees in the whole government, and it's full of police officers and military officers. And in fact, local administration is really just about security, as it was historically, right? Who controlled the hinterland? It's all about controlling the city and sort of fearing the hinterland in some sense, right? So 50 to 80% of Egypt's governors were either retired military officers or from the police, right? And the question becomes also, we did a piece on who pays for local administration. And the answer is there's not much money there. Something like Egypt has, again, 15% or 16% of expenditures at the local level as opposed to the national one. And many other developing countries, it's much higher, right? So they have very little ability to tax, to extract resources. So they're completely dependent on the national ministries. And most employees for very, very local things like lighting and paving, et cetera, are employees of the national ministry, not the local ministry. There isn't a kind of a local civil service, so to speak. So the question becomes is how can local politics and the public interest be strengthened, and how can there be more democratic decentralization? And this is where I think the revolution certainly matters. I'm not as pessimistic as everyone, despite the current government. There is a memory of the revolution. There was an activism. There was mobilization. Many of these people are now in jail or in the United States and elsewhere in the diaspora. But what changes is that there's more demand. There's more demand being generated. And unlike the kind of high modernist planning, the idea is that citizens themselves have to keep making these demands. It might sound kind of patronizing for us to be talking about this sort of thing, but the idea is that residents themselves, as in Latin America and some other places, residents themselves have to become a kind of a political unit of analysis. And what's interesting is Tamarid, which is the rebel campaign that some of you might be familiar with, was a mass petition campaign in May and June of 2013, supposedly kind of materialized out of nothing. And very simple petition campaign. We don't want you anymore, and this was against the Morsi government. Because the poor still have no place, we don't want you anymore. We're still begging loans from abroad. No justice, there's no dignity. Because Egypt is still following the footsteps of the United States. It was a very simple petition campaign, but they went local and they gathered 15 to 21 million signatures, although some people say they are just set up by the military. But whatever, they went local. And it was a sheet of paper that anybody could Xerox, right? And it became the impetus to get rid of Morsi. And it was a provocation or a precipitous to the military stepping in. So I'm not saying it was a fabulous thing. I'm just saying it's an example of local mobilizing, simple, pragmatic claims making, right? So again, at Tadammen, one of the things that we do is to talk about the successes. If we think seriously about the right to the city, one of the things that we want to do is to document the mobilization that has happened, the possibilities that are there. So this is a case study. We do these urban initiatives. Again, you can see some of the good mapping because we work with architects. And So this is a city, this is a very densely populated part of what's called Mohandisin, which is the city of the engineers that Nasser built in the 60s, right? But this was a story of a popular committee that still is active until today. In order to build a more inclusive notion of Cairo so that people don't dismiss these areas, Mit-Opa is a very old area. It has a history, so we wanted to document that history and talk about the area to sort of include it. We went to the area and asked people to do mapping, to map the area themselves, and it was wonderful what people came up with. In one area, there was this great map that a woman did with the one tree in the whole area, and the tree was very prominent, you know. Anyway, so the idea is we should know the city and the multiplicity of the histories of the city. But at the same time, this popular committee made demands. They wanted a new health center. They organized for a health center. This area they were still reliant on these bottles of Butagaz and Butagaz distribution. They were supposed to get natural gas lines into the neighborhood, but of course, the head of the local party was the Butagaz distributor, so he never extended the gas lines. And then this popular committee went and they said, look, there's this money, let's do it, and let's work with us. We know how to do this. They worked with architects, kind of guerrilla architects, some young architects. They found out how much it cost to do this, how much labor cost, how much the cement cost, et cetera, with the local government. And this is the time when the local government is afraid of the people since it's after the revolution. So they had some political leverage. But at the same time, they were renegotiating this relationship. And there was supposedly money to pave 2 streets, and they were able to pave 9 streets, right? And people participated in. They were very excited. And rather than put asphalt down, they put these cheaper pavers down. And why is that important? Because everybody is always breaking up the streets in Cairo, and you could do this in a temporary fashion. You could take some of them out. So it was kind of a new design, which apparently has some problems, but anyway. And for us, we put more analysis into this, right? So we talked about the right to information. We talked about the importance of knowing and getting information back and forth from the local government, things that we assume about our local government in this country. And this is not insignificant, right? If we also write about global examples, so if you look at a very important movement in India for the right to information, it's of course a global movement, but in India in particular, much of it started by a local NGO, right? And that NGO started making claims and putting and organizing and mobilizing, and that NGO led eventually to a very, very much strengthened right to information law. So that I think there were these social audits, and like 2 million social audits had been done in villages to look at how much the price of labor was, or the price of cement was. It was used throughout the country, and some people would say it's responsible for the new government in India today, the anti-corruption movement as well, right? So again, the right to know, the right to information is pretty important, and has global examples. I think I'm running out of time here, but the other thing I would just say is that again, I started writing about informal networks, the informal economy, and now we're moving to, we need to sort of strengthen the formal sector. If you look at the Middle East and the globe, 74% of the population has elected mayors, whether they're indirect or direct, elected directly or indirectly. Egypt is, the Middle East has incredibly weak local government. Mostly only Lebanon and Morocco have elected mayors, and they also have appointed governors over them, and Morocco has the French prefect system, which is another problem, right? So why aren't there mayors in a city of 20 million people, right? Why is it all military dominated? And we know that mayors are important, right? You may know that the current president of Indonesia was a local mayor in a small provincial town who was incredibly successful at dealing with street vendors in his town. And his success in dealing with street vendors, which are also a real problem in Egypt and lots of other places, propelled him to become the mayor of Jakarta, and he's the first mayor of Indonesia, the first person that's out of the Suharto military-dominated elite for 35 years, right? And so, again, how do we try to make this happen? We also did a constitutional analysis of the many drafts of the Egyptian constitution. Informal settlements are now in the Egyptian constitution. The Egyptian constitution says it's going to try to solve the problem of informal settlements, so it's always seen as a problem. There are new changes in the local administration law. We can't go into that, but let me just. But what we're doing is what also there are lots of other groups that are trying to do this. But one of our big objectives through this constitutional campaign, we tried and we succeeded in forming a coalition of about 7 or 8 different groups, because of course a lot of this can't be done alone. The human rights community, the women's movement, etc., has found these kind of timely coalitions which join together and then come apart to be very important. And of course the current very repressive conditions mitigate against some of the work of this coalition, but people are still in place. And I also want to point out that there are many other initiatives. Cluster is a group of architects, Omar Nagati and Beth Stryker, who are doing really interesting work and design projects. The Shadow Ministry of Housing, Cairo Observer, Mohammed Shehed. There's a community of people. Mugaura is this architectural hub that's just brought all kinds of people together doing really interesting things. And I think I should probably stop there, and I can, answer some questions if you have them. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane, for this incredible overview of Cairo. Like, I think, for whom are not very familiar about the situation and the very recent past of Cairo, I think this has been an incredible talk. And I want to just start with something. And Diana, correct me if I'm wrong, Tadamun in English is coalition, collaboration, solidarity. Which word fits? Solidarity. Okay. So, and when I remember when I first came across that Tadamun has been constructed, I was very excited because it was, one of the first and early initiatives to make things visible and to have a publicly database about the urban realities of Cairo, and this wasn't really there. It was very hard to access data and to know what's happening, even if there's any kind of initiatives. So Tadamun is one of the first, and since 2011 there's many other initiatives, as Diane pointed out. Thinking of what to respond to in your presentation, you reminded me how Cairo is a city between a lot of contradictions, between an escapist urbanism and fabricated urbanism, between centers and peripheries, between a lot of formal and informal, and how all these live together in proximity and distance, and the tensions that lies between both. And another reminder was how the military controls the land. So wherever you go, you're kind of enframed because the military is the one who grants you the land. If you need to build or develop any kind of development, whether, of course, the informal don't go through that, path, but the formal has to go there. And so whether center or periphery, you have the larger territory. And what else I would love to touch upon is the incredible potentiality in the informalities, because I think this presentation shed a lot of light on informalities, and I'm still positive. This is my first year in the US, and it's actually my first year to live outside of Egypt ever, and I'm still very positive about how in these very opaque situations and urban realities that we live in, you have an incredible potentiality to, in these, especially in these informal areas, you have people that every single day are reinventing everything in their lives. From public transport, they're doing their own local transport, from their piping, from their housing. And the housing is not like shanty towns or very, light things. It's concrete and bricks, and it takes a lot of economies, and it takes a lot of knowledge behind it. And how in these, that came upon this last 2-3 months, just a campaign that a guy wore Spider-Man and took these pictures in every part of these cities, just to highlight that every Egyptian living in these circumstances is a Spider-Man. And he's doing this huge campaign that is getting so much awareness and being exhibited everywhere. So there is much to talk about Cairo, and I think we can do that in the discussion, in the Q&A. Yeah, I think I should stop here. Because if I open, I have a lot. And maybe I will shed one thing I'm doing here while at my Loeb Fellowship. I'm working on a project called projective mapping, which is I'm trying to map or to try to find a way to draw the political, and how urban realities are a way and a form to inform you about the power struggles and conflicts and debates over space, and how the physicality and the construct can be a tool and an agent and a sensor to learn about how the power is shifting from one party to the other, what's happening, how can gaining space and claiming space, whether Tahrir or over the city, tells you a lot about what, Mubarak lost a battle over 18 days, but he actually lost a battle over a city before he loses this Tahrir Square. So we can discuss further in the Q&A. Thank you.
So as you saw earlier, there's going to be a reception with the Club Medina group soon. And so I think maybe we can take a few minutes just before going that, because I think it would be nice to just, have a conversation. But maybe we can also ask Abdul Basir El Sayed to join. As I said, he's a PhD student who's just joined Diane and working together in DC. And so he's literally even more recent than Shahira. So you'll have a chance. But I really do want to open this up. So basically, this is our Q&A. I don't know, Dan, if you want to say anything.
I just also want to say Abdul Basir is here on Carnegie Centennial Fellowships for visitors from the Arab world and social sciences. So that's a program at American University. And if any of you have friends from the Arab world who might want a visiting fellowship for a short period of time, we had a call for proposals, and contact me and spread the word.
Thank you so much. Abdul Basir, do you want to make some critical remarks in relation to Diane's presentation or any other thoughts? And use the mic so that they can hear you.
Okay. First of all, I'd like to thank you for this interesting presentation, because you summarized the situation in Egypt, and you are visualizing the city as a collection of small, isolated cities. And as Shahira said, several dichotomies can be detected: formal versus informal, gated communities versus elite gated communities versus poor people. And this shows that Cairo is a complicated city. It is not easy. I mean, then Diane showed some initiatives, and I have some comments on Diane's work, because you showed us this is good for Americans to know about Cairo, but if you are raising something like that in Egypt, for me, for example, that's something that I already know about. And I think that complicated issue requires a complicated approach. And you say تضامن. Tadamun is to let people know about the rights, like governance and constitution, and to simplify the governance for people. But here, I have two comments. First, I have read many books, many Arabic books about governance in Egypt, and still I don't understand anything. So, yeah. What Tadamun is going to do to simplify the governance for the public? And then, what if I know my rights? What can I do? How can I claim it? This is important. Another thing is that you are trying to involve people, I mean, adopting a participatory planning approach. And I see that there are also some initiatives that you already raised, like GTZ or GIZ now, that they said also that they are trying to adopt a participatory planning approach by encouraging local communities to decorate their neighborhoods. So I'd like to ask to what degree Tadamun is different from these initiatives, because if you are going to see one of the pilot studies, Manshit Nasser, for example, that was the pilot study for GIZ, and you see it now, it's like yesterday, it's like 10 years ago, or it's the same situation. So, also, so I don't know.
Maybe you can let her answer.
And we can also take questions. You know, those are all really good points. There's this kind of contradiction. You know, people in Egypt really understand power. They understand authority. They understand situations and how to. And they're very good at getting things done and trying to figure things out, obviously. But the idea, in some sense, is it's not simplifying government. It's the idea is how do you try to make a government more accountable? And you're absolutely right. These days, it's incredibly repressive and very difficult. But I think in some ways there are these spaces, there are these places where people have to renegotiate relationships. I think big projects like Aga Khan, other architects, there are people all the time successfully renegotiating. I think in some ways, for various reasons, people have not taken seriously the demands are at a very national level, or the collective life is organized sort of much more at a national level. And I think kind of political organizing and strategizing, and as people like Piven and Cloward in the United States, when make demands on the system, you know, make demands on the social welfare offices, harass bureaucrats. There are imaginative things that people can do, and that communities do all the time. Because as much as we talk about forced evictions, a lot of Egyptian communities are successful at stopping them, right? And so there is a kind of collective energy and power that some communities have, and the question is, how do you figure that out? For example, in Izbir Khairallah, this one area, they have been working for 30 years to try to get title to their land. We did a case study about them and wrote about it. Other activists the important part of that is they got a successful decision from one of the higher courts in Egypt that there was a public interest in the right to land, in settling. If that people had settled on land for a long time, that there was a public interest. The state had a public interest in keeping them there, Did anybody know about this? Did other activists know about this? No. These stories are all sort of kept, and people don't know them. And so the idea is, the other thing that we try to do is, and people in Cairo try to do, is to link up activists. And so what are the success cases, and how do you replicate that? Something like a legal strategy and precedent, et cetera, are tools that have been useful in other places, right? Yeah, absolutely. How do we claim the government? It's not easy to do. On the other hand, there was just an uprising, right? And so there is this collective memory. There was tremendous energy all over the place. I'm sure you know lots of colleagues and others who started organizations, et cetera, and when political opportunities open, those same people will be trying to do these kinds of things. And when political opportunities close and repression increases, people have to change their strategies. The question about GTZ, you know, those projects also were very much participation after the fact. You know, GTZ is also a German. It's the German Development Fund, the German Development Agency. They're a quasi-governmental agency. They have to be very careful of their relationships with the government. And so the participation happens after the fact, and they're not involved, they're not in the engine, they're not making decisions. It's kind of, as some people would say, decor. I mean, they try to do it, but it's a very difficult thing to do. On the other hand, if you think about examples like from Latin America and the whole participatory budgeting movement, the president of Brazil comes from the Workers' Party. One of the things that the Workers' Party did after military dictatorship in Brazil, after the landed elites in Brazil were still in charge of the parliament after the end of dictatorship, is they went local for an election strategy, right? And so the Workers' Party organized at a very low level. They started participatory budgeting, where they got little bits of money, and they said, let's decide about what we want to fund. And participatory budgeting, the idea, the strategy, it involved lots of professionals. It sort of mollified class conflict because architects and others and teachers were involved. And participatory budgeting has spread all over the world. And of course, some people criticize it, but it was innovative at a certain point in time, and it kept the Workers' Party alive from a very regional party to a national party, right? So I think people have to think kind of strategically about whatever opportunities are there, and it's not easy. It's not easy at all. I just want to say one more thing about what Shahira said. It's really important too, about the contradictions, right? The contradictions and the potentiality of informality. I mean, the billions of dollars that people invested in those areas suggest what kinds of other things can be done too. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Tamer. I'm from Cairo too. First year PhD student in urban planning here at the GSD. So thanks for the interesting presentation, and thanks for the GSD and Akhan program for letting us know more about the experience of Tadamun, because I think it's one of the revolutionary experiments in Cairo in imagining new ways of practicing politics without necessarily being on the street in the normal way it has been celebrated everywhere. So it's a different way of imagining what a political action might be. Now that I have said the nice part, one question and one provocation. So for the question, I think that there has been a lot of talk on the notion of the local state in Egypt, and I think this is really interesting because it stands in opposition to the reification of what the central bureaucracy is and what it can really do in Egypt. So the question is the authoritarian regime in Egypt that authoritarian in terms of at least effectuating its urban presence? But the problem for me with the notion of the local state is that it's not really urbanistically specific or architecturally specific. So people have been talking about that in the context of urban planning, urban design, environmental issues, the work of Jeannie Sowers, for instance, or even in delivery of basic services. So my question, what would be the specific form that urban issues can take to exemplify the notion of the local state? In other words, would there be an architecture to practicing politics at that local level? So, and for the provocation, yeah. The next one is probably more provocative, but I would definitely agree that neoliberal policies have effectuated a lot of instability, not just in Egypt, but in many countries and cities in the global south. But on the other hand, what would be the theoretical distinction between the gated communities of Cairo and the experiments of participatory planning? I know that this is actually, I mean, it's something that I would even oppose politically, but theoretically speaking, both are actually experiments in citizens, whatever their class affiliation is, in putting the resources together, creating an environment, whether secluded or not. So how theoretically would you differentiate between those two projects?
You have only 5 minutes.
Yeah. No, really interesting comments. One of the things about architecture that's obviously important is usually architects need clients. And are those clients very wealthy people or developers or governments? And so what happens when, I mean, this is not a new question, obviously, but what happens when you don't have a lot of clients and a lot of money? And people like Agnès Deboulet from France talks about neoliberalism from the sky, and looking at and she looks at the architecture of informal areas and the planning of informal areas and how that really works. But your question about kind of the local level and politics and architecture, you know, I guess the point that we're trying to make is there's the regulatory framework, and whether the regulatory framework is neoliberal, is sort of high modernist. There's a tremendous amount of politics involved in that regulatory framework. Of course, informality itself, a lot of people would argue, is a product of neoliberalism, right? And so informality, some people would argue, deregulation, et cetera, is itself neoliberal, right? But the question about sort of, I'm sort of going off here, but the sort of, what about the local, and why talk about the local so much? For example, we have a piece that looks at the question of centralization in Egypt and compares it to the French system of centralization. When you're in Egypt, you hear about, we need a strong state, we need the prefect. The state has to be at the local level all the time. And Egyptians will go on about the French system of centralization. So we looked into the French system of centralization and we found it had been reformed, right? So the French system at the local level, there were major problems in France. There was Paris, and then the rest of the country was going to cede. And so there were major revisions in French centralism and the system of the prefect to make representation at the local level more viable, to make mayors, to strengthen mayors. So now there's a whole body of the legislature that is just mayors, actually, in France. So it's not to kind of reify the local and the authentic and the informal, et cetera. It's to really look very seriously at very pragmatic questions like money and budgets and employees, and also to hold the government accountable as much as you can to what the law says. So, for example, there are opportunities in the different laws that regulate some of these entities. Sometimes it says that they have to have public hearings about things. And so does anyone pay attention to that, or do people try to sort of say, we need public hearings now? So again, it's not meant to kind of glamorize or romanticize the local. It's to try to understand political spaces at the local. You know, yes, you could argue that participatory planning is kind of the NGOization and sort of neoliberal, it's the same. I understand your point. Actually, we are not doing anything about participatory planning. What we're talking about more is the right to the city and the right to the democratic management of the city. Participatory planning, there's various projects going on where it's all these design studios, as I know they're now called, and people do really interesting things about what can happen in these neighborhoods. There's no money for it. Either you get foreign funds, the government doesn't have money for it. So rather than do those kind of participatory planning exercises and design studios that actually frustrate people because nothing is going to come of it, I think you need to work at how much money local government has and can they raise taxes and those kinds of issues. And you really need to try to put more effort in that local level. I'm not sure that answers your questions. But.
I will try to answer your question. Regarding the informal and the gated communities, and if I understood your question right, I think at the end of the day, those two entities, if you look from 2011, they work together. And you can see them as one force that was, in a way, forced to move forward within a stagnant society. So they had to move. So whether you go and build gated communities, because the state gave them very minimal, land with very minimal pay for the meters or for the Faddan or whatever. So they give them so much of, go ahead and build. But you have to do your own infrastructure. You have to do everything. So they had to do that on one level. The informal had to do the same way, the same thing, because nothing is provided. You just build your own house. So at the end of the day, if you look at it, it's like two sides of one coin that, an auto construction that was happening and in a way claiming the whole periphery of Cairo. And they're both marginalized as societies, whether the gated or the others. So at the end of the day, there were peripheral marginalized people who, if you might argue that they came together in the 25th of Jan, just to, say, we've been out there, you let us play in this playground on the periphery, and now we're coming to claim the center. The other thing about how Cairo is today regarding authority, the situation is getting worse and worse and worse. For example, just, this semester, the fall semester, the opening of the academic year at Cairo University, there is a new security, a hired private security system for the 15 state universities from Azhar and others. And this is only to contain how the universities, because this is the only playground was left for protesters. And the other thing was there's amount of, from the summer to the fall, a lot of laws were changed. So the deans and presidents were by election, they're now by appointment. And actually the president can fire the dean anytime in his term, whenever, if he's appointed for 3 months, he's get it out. So the whole laws is a lot of things are coming under the carpet and changing how, so I think if the locals were only, this is the part where election were happening and appointment were happening, it's now any place where election is happening is, just get out the elections.
Just one other thing also, just a tiny bit. It's important to realize informality is not just in the periphery, right? In the most fancy buildings, the most upscale luxury, it's a question of regulations and how strong they are and not. And so informality is really everywhere.
Thank you very much for your talk. My name is Anya. I'm actually not a design school student. I'm a PhD student in political science. And so my question is really more on a different side of your talk, which is more about the subjects, the people in these informal quarters. And I was kind of waiting throughout your talk to get to the point where you would tell us a little more of the voices of these people, what they were wanting to change, what struggles they had actually with the government or with these local authorities, with these mayors, security officials, and so on. And I just wondered, I mean, two things, two of the pictures crystallized this question for me. One was the Aga Khan kind of reestablishment of the park, and where you could see the houses on the other end that were painted and were done up beautifully, that hadn't been done before. And I think you mentioned something very briefly, there were these regulations in place that were preventing them from doing that, and I kind of that just went off in my head, like, why? What were the regulations?
Tourism. So if you live in a very old house, they're so afraid of, they can't renovate it because they're afraid that the touristic value would somehow go down. So you have this very bizarre situation where people who live near monuments, there are all kinds of, in some sense,
so
you
want to look old, like you want the house to look old?
Yes, and also, I mean, there's a lot to say about that, but the ways in which historic renovation works, what's renovated, what's not. I have a colleague who's now at Brandeis, Sarah El-Kazaz, who writes about historic renovation, and she talks about public goods for the facade. So if the facade gets fixed and the alleyway, then you get public goods and you get water and you get clean streets. If you live 2 streets away from that, you don't, because, and there's just tremendously interesting things about the renovations of the Fatimid city, and now you can get buses in and they're cleaner, and they got rid of the wholesale garlic market so that you have shisha shops. One shop is the next shop is the next. Now there's no tourists, and I lived in those neighborhoods, and they were normal they weren't normal, but they were vibrant neighborhoods, and they get remade. In terms of your question about voice, one of the things that we're trying to do, and we've done, it is to document some of these initiatives and to tell this story. So it's not that we're going around in any kind of universal way or any kind of systematic way. It's really about situations and cases and mobilization to put some effort in to understand it and to dig a little bit deeper and to represent it, not just for a sort of a academic audience or a foreign audience, but I mean, the whole idea is much more for a local audience, right? And so that's where, in some sense, the voices are, but it's not in a sense of telling individual stories. It's actually kind of more at the trying to talk a little bit more about the community level and the collective level.
I guess my question was more like, I was trying to understand what was the major issue that the Tadammun was trying to break through. Was it to try to kind of get past, inform? I mean, one thing that was definitely very clear was that you were informing people about their rights. But beyond information, were you also trying to actually, help them to get past through some of these blocks with authorities?
Well, in a more abstract way, I would say, in the sense of writing about legislation, writing about the new laws that exist, writing about the Constitution, trying to form alliances with human rights groups and housing rights groups, and organizations like Habitat for Humanities and other to highlight some of the importance of these things. Not that Egyptians don't know about it, but to sort of put it together in a kind of a different way. But the main thing really is in a sense social justice in the built environment, and critiquing the kind of high modernist urban planning paradigm of the Egyptian government for the last 30 years. Simply, I guess.
Can I just thank all of our speakers, Dan, Shahira, Abdul Basir, and thank all of you really for a wonderful evening and all the really interesting ideas. I'm sure that we will be able to continue these in the pit. There's sort of refreshments and sustenance for all of us, so maybe we can sort of follow up some of the conversation. So thanks again for being here. Thank you.